Imagine you need your leg amputated. The surgeon is ready, the instruments are laid out, and someone hands you a leather strap to bite down on because that is the only thing standing between you and the full, unmedicated experience of having your leg sawed off while you're completely conscious. No numbing agent, no sedative, nothing. This was medicine for most of human history. And the people who practiced it knew something that we've almost entirely forgotten. The greatest threat in surgery wasn't infection, wasn't blood loss, and wasn't the wound itself. It was time. Every second a patient spent on the table was another second they could die from the shock of pure, unbearable pain. What surgery looked like before anesthesia isn't just a medical history curiosity. It's one of the most visceral windows into how desperately humans have always needed relief from suffering, and how far they were willing to go to find it. Before the 1840s, if you needed surgery, you needed luck, speed, and a very high tolerance for what was about to happen to you. The ancient world understood pain well enough to know they needed something to fight it. Egyptians used preparations made from the mandrake plant, a root with mild sedative properties. The Greeks and Romans knew about opium, pressing it from the poppy plant and mixing it into wine or water. There are records from ancient Mesopotamia describing physicians administering cannabis smoke to patients before minor procedures. These weren't effective anesthetics in any modern sense, but they represent something important. Humans recognized from the very beginning that cutting into a conscious person was a problem that needed solving. The Silk Road carried knowledge of these plant-based remedies across continents. Chinese physicians in the 3rd century wrote about a preparation called ma fei san, which some historians believe was a mixture of cannabis, opium, and other botanical compounds dissolved in wine. It was supposedly used by the legendary surgeon Hua Tuo to perform abdominal operations. Whether those accounts are fully accurate or somewhat mythologized, the impulse behind them is real. If you're going to cut someone open, you want them not to feel it. The problem is that none of these solutions worked reliably. Opium in sufficient quantities could dull pain, but it could also kill. Mandrake and henbane, another plant used for sedation, contained alkaloids that had genuine physiological effects, but dosing was almost impossible to control. Give too little and the patient felt everything. Give too much and you'd poisoned them. There was no margin for error, no pharmacological understanding of why any of it worked, and no consistency in the plants themselves, which varied in potency depending on where they were grown and how they were prepared. So most surgeons simply accepted that pain was part of the procedure. The operating theater in a pre-anesthesia hospital was not a quiet, controlled environment. It was a spectacle. In large European teaching hospitals, wooden galleries were constructed around the surgical table so that medical students could watch. The audience sometimes included curious members of the public who paid for the privilege. The surgeon would enter, often in a frock coat stained from previous procedures, because germ theory hadn't been established yet and cleanliness wasn't considered relevant. The patient would be brought in, often already terrified, and would be held down by several strong assistants. Then, the surgery would begin. What surgeons discovered, through brutal necessity, was that speed saved lives. Not because faster surgery was technically better, but because less time on the table meant less pain, less blood loss, and less chance that the patient's heart would simply give out from the physiological shock of what was happening to them. The best surgeons weren't necessarily the most precise, they were the fastest. Robert Liston was a Scottish surgeon practicing in London in the 1830s, and he was famous for being the quickest knife in Britain. He could amputate a leg in under 30 seconds. Accounts from the period describe him holding his scalpel in his teeth to free both hands during the most critical moments of a procedure. He wore distinctive green operating coats. Patients would be strapped to the table, and witnesses described hearing the screaming from outside the building before the surgery even began, because patients knew what was coming. The mortality statistics from this era are difficult to compile with precision, but what historians have established is that the probability of dying from surgery was extraordinarily high. Infection, now understood to be the primary cause of post-operative death, was not yet linked to bacteria. Surgeons moved directly from one patient to the next without washing their hands. Instruments were not sterilized. The mortality rate for amputations in some hospital settings ran above 50%. And yet people still chose surgery, because the alternative was frequently worse. Pain management during the actual procedure relied on a few consistent approaches. Alcohol was the most common. Getting a patient drunk before surgery didn't eliminate sensation, but it could reduce their ability to fully process what was happening, and it provided some small buffer against the psychological devastation of being cut while conscious. The problem was that alcohol also thinned the blood and complicated recovery. It was a trade-off surgeons made with full knowledge that they were making things harder for themselves in order to make things marginally more bearable for the patient. Physical restraint was universal. Patients were held down by trained assistants whose entire job was to prevent movement during the procedure. Any motion at all could redirect a blade, cause additional damage, or extend the time required to complete the surgery. The assistants were not there for comfort. They were there because a patient in extreme pain will instinctively try to stop what is causing it, and that instinct could be fatal. Some surgeons developed their own strategies. Pressure applied to nerve bundles before an incision could temporarily reduce sensation in a limb. Cold water, ice when it was available, applied directly to tissue could numb an area slightly. These were imperfect, inconsistent, and often impractical in the middle of a procedure. But they represented surgeons actively trying to solve the problem rather than simply accepting it. There was also a psychological dimension that doesn't get enough attention. Some patients, described in the historical record, became almost catatonic before major procedures, particularly amputations. Modern understanding of trauma suggests this was a dissociative response, the nervous system essentially protecting itself by partially detaching from the experience. Surgeons of the era sometimes interpreted this as composure or courage. The patient was neither composed nor courageous. They were in a state of psychological shock before the physical shock had even begun. Ether had been synthesized in the 16th century. Nitrous oxide was identified and characterized in the late 1700s by Joseph Priestley, the same chemist who isolated oxygen. For decades, both substances were primarily curiosities, used in social settings, inhaled at parties where people laughed and stumbled and fell down. The anesthetic properties were noticed and then essentially ignored. The distance between recreational use and surgical application turned out to require not a new discovery, but a shift in how the people doing surgery thought about what they were trying to accomplish. Crawford Long, a physician in rural Georgia, used ether on a patient in 1842 to remove a small cyst from the back of his neck. The patient felt nothing. Long documented it, shared it with almost no one, and continued practicing medicine in a small town for several years before the significance of what he had done rippled outward. In 1844, a dentist named Horace Wells attended a public demonstration of nitrous oxide and watched a man under its influence injure his leg without appearing to feel any pain. Wells arranged to have one of his own teeth extracted while breathing nitrous oxide the following day. He reported feeling nothing. He was convinced he had found the solution to surgical pain. His subsequent public demonstration at Harvard Medical School went badly. The patient cried out during the procedure. Whether the dosage was insufficient or the patient's reaction was less than it appeared, the audience declared it a failure. Wells never recovered professionally. He eventually became dependent on chloroform, committed a crime while under its influence, was arrested, and died by suicide in a prison cell in 1848, the same year that ether anesthesia was transforming surgery in hospitals across Europe and America. William Morton, a dentist who had worked briefly with Wells, arranged a more successful public demonstration at Massachusetts General Hospital on October 16, 1846. The patient was a young man with a vascular tumor on his jaw. Morton administered ether, the surgeon John Collins Warren made the incision, the patient remained still and silent, and when it was over, Warren turned to the assembled audience and said that this is no humbug. Within months, the news had spread to Europe. Within a year, surgery without anesthesia had become the exception rather than the rule in most major hospitals. The transformation was almost immediate because the need had always been there. Everyone knew the problem. The moment a reliable solution appeared, it was adopted everywhere at once. What changed wasn't just the patient experience, though that change was total and absolute. What changed was what surgery could actually be. Before anesthesia, surgeons were constrained by the amount of pain a patient could survive. Speed was the primary virtue because exposure time was directly tied to survival probability. Precision was secondary. Complexity was nearly impossible. You couldn't spend 40 minutes carefully working inside a body cavity when every second on the table pushed the patient closer to dying from shock. After anesthesia, the clock disappeared. Surgeons could take the time required to do something correctly rather than simply doing it fast. The interior of the human body became accessible in ways it had never been before. The development of antiseptic technique by Joseph Lister in the 1860s, built on Louis Pasteur's germ theory, followed anesthesia by roughly 2 decades and completed the transformation. Suddenly, surgery could be not just painless, but survivable. The distance between the era of Robert Liston and his 30-second amputations and the era of modern surgery is less than 200 years. On a historical timeline, it's almost nothing. The techniques, tools, and knowledge that make contemporary surgery possible accumulated over centuries, but almost all of the fundamental enabling conditions came together in an extraordinary compression of progress between roughly 1846 and 1900. The surgeons who worked before anesthesia weren't primitive or indifferent to suffering. Many of them were deeply bothered by what they had to do. They simply had no alternative. The speed they developed, the restraint techniques, the psychological strategies for managing patients before and after procedures, all of it represented genuine problem-solving applied to a situation that had no good solution. The patients who survived surgery in that era did so through a combination of physical resilience, statistical luck, and the skill of whoever was holding the blade. The ones who didn't survive were victims of everything medicine hadn't yet figured out, and of the fundamental horror of trying to repair a human body while that body was fully conscious and understood exactly what was happening to it. When you trace the arc from mandrake preparations in ancient Egypt to ether in an operating theater in 1846, what you see is not a story of ignorance followed by sudden enlightenment. It's a story of continuous effort to solve an obvious, urgent, devastating problem by people who understood the problem completely and simply lacked the tools to fix it. The leather strap you bit down on wasn't a symbol of barbarism. It was the best available technology for what was happening to you, and the moment something better existed, everyone used it immediately because everyone had been waiting for it the entire time.